Good evening and welcome to Washington National Cathedral. My name is Ruth Fry and I'm Director of Programs here at the Cathedral. And tonight we are pleased to partner with the Aspen Institute through its Aspen Around Town series for this panel discussion on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1963 letter from the Birmingham jail. This program is part of the Cathedral's mission to convene conversations and public dialogue on critical issues of our day, and we thank you for joining us. This is the Cathedral's second collaboration with the Aspen Institute. 2 years ago, our program together featured 3 former secretaries of state for a discussion on value and diplomacy, and it was moderated by Walter Isaacson, President and CEO of the Aspen Institute. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome him back as moderator for this program. And now, I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Eric Motley to introduce our panel and to set the stage for this evening's discussion. Dr. Motley is both Vice President at the Aspen Institute and Executive Director for Aspen Around Town series. He also serves on the Cathedral chapter, which is our board of directors, and we at the Cathedral are deeply grateful for what he has done to make this evening possible. Please welcome Dr. Eric Motley.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Ruth. And to the Bishop of Washington who's here, thank you very much for inviting us into this beautiful space. And to the Dean of the Cathedral, Dean Gary Hall, thank you very much. And thank you for coming to this event. And to all of those viewers who are watching on C-SPAN, thank you for tuning in. The Aspen Around Town series is an integral part of the Aspen Institute's outreach to audiences all across the city, where we partner with historic institutions providing enlightened conversation from the arts and the humanities to social issues. It's written by an Aspen trustee, Michelle Smith, and the Robert H. Smith Family Foundation. I'd like to acknowledge one person who's in the audience as well, who's associated with the Aspen Institute, and that's Burl Bernhardt, who should probably be on this platform as well, who played a very active role as a civil rights attorney during the Kennedy administration. So Burl, we're very happy to have you with us. As well as Alma Gildenhorn, who's an Aspen trustee who philanthropically supports programs like this program here in the city. We have a very distinguished panel tonight. They don't need introductions, it's in your program. But we have with us the Dean of the Washington National Cathedral, Gary Hall, who is in his 10th position as Dean of this cathedral. We have the historic and legendary, iconic American civil rights leader, Julian Bond. We have Professor Stephen Carter from Yale University Law School, who is a very prolific writer and a novelist. And we have with us the U.S. Poet Laureate, Natasha Trethewey. We have moderating Walter Isaacson, whose illustrious career spans journalism and public service. Why are we here tonight in the National Cathedral? The last 5 years of Martin Luther King's life, he explored and re-examined some fundamental ideas about human rights. And those ideas were articulated in his speeches, in his writings, but certainly in the letter from the Birmingham City Jail. But it culminated here in this cathedral in the Canterbury pulpit on March 31st, 1968, the Sunday before he was assassinated, only days later in Memphis. So we are here in this special place because Martin Luther King was here only days before he lost his life. I'd like for us to pause for a moment and listen to the words of Martin Luther King as they were preached from the Canterbury pulpit on that Sunday morning here in this cathedral.
And there are those who often sincerely say to the Negro and his allies in the white community, why don't you slow up? Stop pushing things so fast. Only time can solve the problem. And if you will just be nice and patient and continue to pray, in 100 or 200 years, the problem will work itself out. Well, that is an answer to that myth, and it is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm sorry to say this morning that I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists of our nation, the people on the wrong side, have used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. So we must help time and realize that the time is always right to do right.
Amazing. Dedicated people who will be the co-workers of God. It's a wonderful line to think of it coming from this pulpit right behind me. And also the echoes in that wonderful sermon, the echoes of the letter from the Birmingham jail. At the Aspen Institute, we have as the core thing that we have done for more than 60 years, it's called the Aspen Seminar. Eric took it, and I think that he was an exemplar of what it's all about. The Aspen Seminar starts with Plato, and it ends with Gandhi, and then the letter from the Birmingham jail, because it's so important for us to understand our values. That's why I want to salute Eric for what he does with the Aspen Institute and with this program in particular, which is to make sure that we pause and reflect and discuss values and also the intellectual and moral underpinnings of the actions we take. And so I welcome you to what we at the Institute call Eric Around Town instead of Aspen Around Town, and you can see why we call it that. There are 8 people in the world who can truly say that they were students of Dr. Martin Luther King. That's because he taught one class in his entire life. He happened to go to Morehouse College, and there were 8 people in that class. There's probably, I would call it an act of fate, but in the Cathedral, I will say it was divine providence, that one of those 8 people, when he was just a young student at Morehouse, was Julian Bond. What was it like to have the Reverend Dr. King as a teacher?
Well, this was a class he co-taught with a man named Dr. Samuel Williams, who had taught King philosophy when King had been a student at Morehouse College. And it was supposed to be a survey course, all the great philosophers, Plato, late Aristotle down the line. But it became mostly a discussion of first the Montgomery bus boycott, which is fresh in our minds, and what King would do next and what he was doing now. And the oddity for me is that I've talked to most of my co-students, and almost to a man and woman, we have no memory of what was really discussed. And none of us thought to bring a tape recorder to class so we could tape whatever it was King said, whatever it was.
Wait, by the way, was he famous then?
Yes, but not the way he's famous now.
Yeah.
But he was famous then. Montgomery was just behind him. He was a well-known figure, well-known personality. He had moved back to Atlanta from Montgomery, had taken a position as co-pastor of his father's church. So he was famous. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what were you, when he went to the Birmingham jail, you had already formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. You did that when you came out of Morehouse, or when you were a student, I guess, at Morehouse. Tell me about your relationship and the relationship of SNCC to what was happening in Birmingham.
Well, you know, some of these civil rights scenes were fixed in the thought of the people who were in charge. Birmingham was an SCLC activity, not a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, not
Southern Christian Leadership Conference,
yes,
which was
not
Dr. King's organization.
Yes, not an NAACP activity, not a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was an SCLC activity. And people in SNCC, people in the NAACP may have been there, but it was their activity. It's like Selma was initially a SNCC activity, and then Dr. King came and it became a Dr. King activity. So in Birmingham was not a place you would go to just to go join the movement. It's a place you'd go to say, how can I help here? What can I do? And I was only in Birmingham 2 or 3 times during the whole stretch of the movement there. So it was somebody else's work.
And how did you become reunited with Dr. King as part of the movement?
Well,
Once again, can you all hear in the back?
he
If you'll speak up a little, Mr.
He and I
Bond.
both lived in Atlanta. I saw him in the grocery store. I saw him here. I saw him there. He came to mass meetings that the Atlanta student movement had. So he was a constant presence in my life. I saw him all the time, talked to him all the time. And there he was.
Dean Hall, thank you very much for this somewhat astonishing venue.
I'm in sales, not in management.
Well, we like to think that it is even as pretty as Aspen in the summer with the mountains behind us, so sure. As venues go. You actually, if I'm correct, were a professor of English in an earlier life.
That's right.
And that was your doctoral and your academic work. And you taught the letter from a Birmingham jail at Berkeley, right?
UCLA.
UCLA.
Yeah, in the 80s, there was a big movement in American education to move freshman composition, which when you're getting a graduate degree in English, you spend some time teaching freshman composition. That's just what you do as a graduate student. And a group of us in the 1980s at UCLA developed a program writing across the curriculum, where students, instead of writing about literary texts, would write about a science text, a social science text, a history piece, a piece of philosophy. And the piece we always started with was Letter from Birmingham Jail. So I taught this piece to probably 1,000 undergraduates in my day. And what was so compelling about it for me were 2 things. One, and even in the 1980s, a lot of undergraduates were shocked to find out that Martin Luther King was really an intellectual. I think that they'd been exposed to King and the holiday and the I Have a Dream speech, and the idea that King actually made an extended intellectual argument just was a surprise to them, because they thought of him as an orator rather than a thinker. But then the second thing, and that's what makes it so interesting to teach, is that the rhetoric of this letter is just extraordinary. I mean, his ability to make his case and argue both from biblical ideas and theological ideas, and to sort of use a kind of moral judo to turn their arguments on themselves is extremely important. So we really looked at it just as a piece of argumentation, and it's extraordinary just in that regard.
But it's also an extraordinary piece where he calls upon the wisdom of great philosophers. And even though Julian Bond doesn't remember which philosophers were taught in the course, I'm wondering if you could give me a sense of whether it's Reinhold Niebuhr, Socrates, Jesus.
Oh, it's aside from Jesus and Paul and the prophets, he cites a lot of biblical people. There's a place, actually, I was looking at it today, where I remembered that he actually cites Kant in the categorical imperative, because you remember he says that one of the hallmarks of an unjust law is when a majority makes a law binding on a minority that is not binding on itself, and that's Kant, which is, you know, that the categorical imperative is to do that which you would, to be bound by a law that you would have binding on others and yourself. But he quotes Socrates several times in there. He quotes Thomas Aquinas when he makes an appeal to natural law. He quotes St. Augustine in his basic definition of an unjust law. So there's a full range of both what you might call Western secular authority, as well as a Western religious authority being appealed to.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Carter, Stephen, if I may.
Please.
You've written a lot about civil disobedience yourself, and you teach that moral question at Yale. Tell us what we learned from Dr. King about the moral imperative of civil disobedience and what you're supposed to do, unlike, say, Edward Snowden, when you commit an act of civil disobedience.
Well, I think the truly extraordinary thing about the letter from Birmingham City Jail, and one of the reasons it resonates with us, aside from both the language of the letter and, for those who are old enough, the memories and the images, is the fact that it was written from Birmingham City Jail. That's the crucial aspect of it. If this had been a letter written on another occasion, a lot of the ideas in it were ideas that had been in his sermons before or since. You just heard some of them echoed in the 1968 sermon here. The fact that he wrote it from jail gives it much of its power, because we saw in Dr. King a man willing to suffer for his beliefs. And in fact, although in the letter King says that he was in jail for parading without a permit, he was actually in jail for violating a court order not to parade without a permit. And the reason that makes a difference, it may seem very technical, the reason it makes a difference is that the way the Supreme Court has read the Constitution for 200 years, well, not quite 200 years, but the way the Supreme Court has read the Constitution for a very long time, if you think a law violates your First Amendment rights, you can violate the law and then when you're arrested, go into court and plead your First Amendment rights. But if you think a court order violates your First Amendment rights, your only recourse is to argue it in court. You cannot defy the order in order to test its validity. That's very old Hornbook constitutional law. King knew that, meaning that there was no recourse. That is to say, there was no real appeal, and the Supreme Court upheld the contempt citation. There was no real appeal from being arrested for following a court order, and he did it anyway. He did it anyway, knowing that no appeal to the First Amendment rights would get him out. The power of the letter comes in part from the sacrifice it entails. All too often, not just Snowden, but more generally, a lot of people nowadays are not willing to go that far. And I understand that's an enormous burden to place on someone. I'm not saying it's the only way to do civil disobedience. I'm saying that King's willingness and the willingness of his followers to do it that way gives it a lot of the resonance, I think, that it has today.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel that civil disobedience does require a willingness to accept punishment?
I think require is too strong. It depends a little bit on, and King makes this point in the letter. You remember, King makes the point about Nazi Germany, and he says in the letter that if he were in Nazi Germany, he hoped that he would be the person who would be protecting Jews with his life. I don't think that King would take the view, if I'm hiding a Jewish family in my house in Nazi Germany, I have to go call the police and say, I've got a Jewish family in my life, take me to jail. I don't think that was his point. But part of the argument you see in the letter, and you see this elsewhere in his writing as well, is a deep belief that beneath this deep American system of injustice that he was fighting, there's also a country that basically loves justice, and that's what you can appeal to. And so going to prison helps you appeal to that country. Now, if you don't believe that a country actually does love justice, then I can see a less of a willingness to say, well, I've got an obligation to take the punishment. That's something we can test even today. But it's important to remember that when you look at the great documents of American history, the things that we think of as the great speeches, the Gettysburg Address, or Lincoln's second inaugural, or Washington's farewell address, or the Four Freedoms speech, and on, what's striking about the others, other than the letter, is they're almost all given by presidents, or at least people who have some kind of actual authority in public life. King's is the only one that we put in this pantheon of great documents that was written by someone who was not in a position of authority in public life, and quite deservedly in the pantheon.
He actually addresses part of it to what we would call, or what we used to call, the great American middle. Even the white moderates, as he puts it in the letter, and he expresses his disappointment in the white moderates, but in a way that he's trying to draw them in. Do you think we've lost that ability to appeal to the center?
Well, is there still a center is one of the terrible dilemmas in American politics. They really, this isn't a left-right issue on both sides. I think there's a tendency to be very condemnatory that often drives centrists away from whoever is speaking, and yet then they get driven away by the other side or something like that. But the fear he expressed about the tendency of moderates to want to slow everything down is very real even today. I remember in my first Aspen seminar, when I was a participant way back in, I think it was 84 or thereabouts, there was a fellow in our seminar. I sat right next to him. He was an executive at a big corporation. I can't remember which one it is. And we got to the letter from Birmingham City Jail. And he had a problem with the letter. And he said, you know, what these people, that's what these people don't understand, and that was his words, these people, is that things happen in their own good time. And I don't know why, even after reading the letter he said this, I don't know why people can't just wait for things to happen when they're supposed to happen, because that's when they happen. That was his
Are you sure he
line.
read the letter? The letter explains
No,
that.
I said he answered. No, I understand that. But my point is that, now that was 30 years ago, but I still think there are, with any kind of change, with any kind of challenge, with anything that's new, there are people who say we've got to slow down. And sometimes it's right to take things slow, but sometimes there are questions of justice that are so fundamental that it's fundamentally wrong to take them slow.
Mm-hmm. Natasha, this is also a great work of literature. I think he starts writing it in the margin of a newspaper, if I remember correctly. Is that right? Because he doesn't have paper. Finally, he's allowed to get a pad of paper from his lawyer. But it's not just an argument, as you would say, that's a essay argument. It's up there as a piece of almost poetry or great prose. Tell us about the literary quality of the letter.
Well, I don't think it's much of a stretch to compare the prose to poetry in the letter. One of the things that I thought about reading it again is, on the one level, how you read it for its sense, for its meaning, but on another level, when you read it again and again, how you begin to hear it. And you hear instead the cadences, the sonic textures, the lyricism and rhythm of syntax and imagery and figurative language that can make the mind leap to a new apprehension of things. And so one of the things that I focus on when I think about it is that sense of repetition that he uses. Of course, there are other places where we hear a lot more repetition, but I think if you look at it in certain ways and really hear it, that poetic scaffolding is the thing that carries us. You know, T.S. Eliot wrote that in some poems we attend to the sense, we attend to the meaning and are moved by the music without knowing it. And in others, we attend to the music and the sense washes over us. When I was first encountering these words as a child, I don't think that I was first moved by the music. At least I wasn't attending to it. I was moved to it without knowing it because I was focused on the sense, on what his words were saying. But indeed, for me, what is poetic about it, what is literary about it, is the way that the music of it and its sonic textures move us and are inextricably linked to those rhetorical devices that he uses to make those arguments.
Tell me about the cadences. Where do those come from?
Well, I think the cadences come from repetition, and I want to read you something that I did just to make this point about it. These are drawn in order from the text, about a few paragraphs of the text. I've just taken the beginnings of certain sentences in which he repeats certain phrases again and again, and then toward the end, a passage without many deletions. I had hoped, but again I have been disappointed. I have heard, but I have longed, and I have watched. In the midst of a mighty struggle, I have heard and I have watched. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at her beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld. Over and over again, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when? And I have wept.
It's almost, it evokes the King James Bible. It has a certain iambic quality, but maybe you could explain that better. I mean, is there a certain rhythm to it that was
Well,
conscious?
it is. I mean, he seemed to have a natural sense of the cadences and the rhythms of syntax. Sometimes we forget to hear those rhythms when we read prose, but the best prose stylist can make a line of prose sing like a poem.
Did you ever hear his father preach, Julian?
Many times, yes.
Wait,
I heard
speak
him-
up, yeah.
I heard him speak one time, at some occasion, I don't remember what it was, and somebody asked him to give the invocation. He said, "I'm the great invocator."
This is Daddy King.
Daddy King, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did he, did Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., develop that sense of cadence, do you think,
I'm sure,
from a preacher's pulpit?
I don't know that he did, but I'm sure he did. You couldn't grow up in that household without getting something, absorbing something from his father, because his father was such a powerful man, such a shorter than Martin, but just a powerful, powerful man. Looked like somebody you didn't want to mess with.
To answer the question that Stephen Carter's seatmate had at the seminar, this whole letter is, I think Dr. King uses the fierce urgency of now in various contexts. He also says in other contexts that the arc of history bends slow, or the arc of progress or history bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. Why back then was time of the essence?
Well, I think this is an attack on moderates. Not an attack on moderates, but it's saying to moderates, what are you doing? What's your answer to these problems? Why are you having these fancy words about things? You know, we're in real trouble. We need something done about it. And you're talking about taking time. This is an attack on the American white moderate who believes more, I can't remember the phrase, more about time than something else. But it's as if King is angry at these people. I take him to be angry and saying, you're just not doing anything and you should be doing something.
He was also angry at them, if I may ask the dean, because they were religious leaders. If I remember correctly, everybody that a letter was addressed to had a congregation.
Right.
And he felt that the religious leadership, especially I assume in Birmingham, but maybe even in the country, didn't pursue social justice, which should have been a mission of the church.
You know, before the dean answers, I spoke a year ago in the temple of the rabbi who signed that letter
the rabbi
that King is responding to. And he spent all of his days from that day until now. He's been long dead. And his son after him spent all his days from that day until now defending what the father stood for, saying that he was a decent man and so on. I'm sure all these people were decent people, but they just didn't understand that time is not what we need now. We need action.
They were decent people, I know, because Dr. King tells us that in the letter. And Dr. King says something that's almost breathtaking, if I remember from the letter, saying, the problem may be decent people like you.
Yes.
The White Citizens Council, I can know how to deal with. Explain that to me.
Well, he's saying that, you know, in the world, we like to think that it's these people in sheets and robes that are really causing the trouble. But we can take care of them. It's you people who are doing absolutely nothing but talking and talking and talking, and that's all you do. That's all you're going to do. You're never going to do anything. You just talk, and you're wasting time and you're killing us because you're taking our time away.
Did you feel that time was not on your side, the way the letter sort of expresses?
Well, no. We thought, and probably wrongly, that time was on our side, that we were winning things. If I think about the time the sit-ins began in Atlanta, and they're over pretty quickly because we won. And then the freedom rides came along and bam, they're over pretty quickly because we won. And then the 64 Civil Rights Act was passed, and it wasn't perfect, but it was passed. then the Voting Rights Act in '65 came along, bam, it was fast. So I felt that time was rushing. Not as fast as I wanted it to, but faster than I ever thought it would.
When did you get elected to the House, the
In
State House?
1960, gee, I can't remember, 65, I
I think it
think.
was 65.
65.
And that shows how fast,
Yeah,
I mean, definitely.
yeah, the court ordered that to happen, but it happened.
It happened.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Dean, we were getting to you in the social justice mission that you've actually helped talk about restoring to the mission even of this cathedral.
Well, I think every faith community has to live in the tension. There's a tension implicit in every faith community. Are we a prophetic community that is disturbing the peace in the service of a higher vision? Or are we the protectors of the status quo? And I think this goes back to Jesus, it goes back to the 8th century prophets, it goes back to all religious traditions. I think what King does in the letter so well is he is, as Mr. Bond says, he is basically arguing with the white moderate, and essentially these well-intentioned people that are saying just take your time, don't rock the boat, and he's essentially using the tradition, Paul and Jesus, against them and saying actually the depth of the tradition that we represent is for turning things upside down. And so I think that, and even to this day, the question of whether the church is enmeshed in the structures of power in the society, or whether we are a movement resisting that tension is endemic to our existence. But King is at least throwing them the idea that their own tradition at its best, at its highest, is actually a disturber of the status quo.
If I had to think of a religious leader who had to most deal with that tension, it might be you, or the good Bishop of Washington, for which thank you for being here with us, ma'am, which is you are the symbol of the grand establishment here on a hill in a Gothic cathedral that is the national cathedral,
right,
which is as close as we have to a Westminster Abbey. This is the American establishment place. And yet you're also trying to rock the establishment to some extent, or at least the status quo. Do you feel that tension in your work, and does Dr. King inform you?
Well, I don't think I'm going to go to jail anytime soon, but I do think, yes, absolutely, Dr. King informs me. I mean, I was a college student when he was assassinated, and I came into the church through the civil rights movement as a high school and college student. And so he's always had a big influence on me, not only this letter, but his life and witness. But beyond that, I think the church itself, and by the church I mean all religious traditions, has gone through a big change in the 40 plus years since almost 40 years since his death, in that we've come to realize that the church is not the, regardless of what some people would say, Christianity is no longer the official religion of America, if it ever in fact was. There is no official religion in America, and the church is essentially a movement following Jesus, trying to call the power structures of the society to account. But then having said that, obviously as an Episcopalian, I represent a church that comes from an established church tradition, and we are in a cathedral with Gothic architecture that communicates power projection, certainly, and the status quo. I would say for this place, the history of the Washington National Cathedral has been a kind of both-and thing. Dean Sayre invited Dr. King to the pulpit in March of 1968. Dean Sayre had also been on the Selma to Montgomery March, had been very much a supporter of Dr. King's work. And so for the whole history of this place, we have managed to kind of live in that tension. And what Anglicans do, we know how to live in a profound tension. and our profound tension is that we are both an established church that represents continuity and order, but also represents the ministry of Jesus. And I think King was brilliant at holding up that tension and making people, what is his phrase about a creative nonviolent tension.
Right.
He creates that creative nonviolent tension in his audience, those clergy, and they can't sit in their establishment place very long and be comfortable.
In fact, when this church was first built, the cathedral was first built, it was on Wisconsin, which was then a poor working man's town, you told me.
Right.
Confluence with the great Embassy Row of Massachusetts Avenue. The tension is almost there on the corner.
And Bishop Satterley had the vision that because we were at the corner of Massachusetts Avenue with the embassies in Wisconsin with the working people, that we would be at the intersection of life. And the cathedral, even when it was built in 1907, started in 1907, a lot of the language that started this cathedral was Walter Rauschenbusch, the theology of the social gospel language. So the call for this place as not only a national monument, but as a beacon of social justice is just deeply in our history and in our self-understanding.
Well, let me give you one example where I think Dr. King did inform your sense of social justice. I say that having read it on your website where you say it, which is you were rather early with the National Cathedral in permitting same-sex marriage. And you did so, and you invoked Dr. King when you explained why you did so. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I think, again, I need to realize my own social location and be careful, and as a white, straight man, and not claim too much for my own situation. But I do want to say that I think for those of us in the faith community in the 21st century, there are a lot of analogies between this moment and the 1960s. I mean, having lived through the civil rights movement and the movement for LGBT equality in the United States, there are many, many parallels between them. And King, to me, was an example, not only because I've sort of internalized this letter, but King's witness was a touchstone for me and for Bishop Buddy, I believe, in the sense that he gives an argument for why the church sometimes has to break the law in the service of a higher law. I mean, that to me, that St. Augustine argument in the letter about how where he's asked, why are you asking people to obey the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision and at the same time challenge segregation orders? He says, well, there's a difference between a just law and an unjust law. And to the extent that our ecclesiastical laws have been unjust about, remember, we're also a church that was segregated. The Episcopal Church not only has a history about gay and lesbian people, but in the South, our churches were segregated. And in fact, our churches in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia were segregated. So just in the same way that we have had to find a way to challenge the law in order to be accountable to a higher righteousness that Jesus would call us to, as we did that in the 60s, many of us have felt the need to do that in the 21st century. And King is really central to that.
Yeah, on gay and lesbian
issues, right.
And Julian, that plays right into you, because if I'm correct, it's not in my notes here, but I remember reading it, you stood up to some of the black churches in order to be in favor of both gay and lesbian rights, and I think same-sex marriage in California. Did you have a problem with the black church there, and why did you do it?
A little problem, because there was a survey I read someplace, I don't know who took it, showing that black people were the least resistant, or the most resistant to the idea of same-sex marriage of all the people in the country. And I remember going to something at the Kennedy Center and being harassed by 3 black ministers telling me I was killing the black church. And of course, I'm not doing anything of the sort, because I was promoting the idea that 2 men could get married if they wanted to, 2 women could get married if they wanted to, and the church said no to that, and therefore I was killing the black church. I mean, it's a stupid argument made by stupid people, but there you go.
And why were you in favor of it? Did you see it as a moral cause?
Well, I just thought, you know, I've been fond of saying that I don't believe there's such a thing as gay rights. They're just rights. There's not such a thing as black rights. They're just rights. And we all have these rights. And I knew too many gay people from my earlier years, my high school years, my college years, people who work with me in the movement, that I couldn't say to them, well, thanks for helping me, appreciate it, but I'm not going to help you. Of course, I couldn't say that. And so I felt bound to do it, and I did it, and I was glad to do what I could.
The dean raised one of your close friends and favorite philosophers, St. Augustine, a moment ago. And I know you teach, Stephen, don't you? I have heard you talk about St. Augustine, so I suspect you may teach him. Just and unjust laws, how do we tell the difference?
Well, I actually think it's hard, and even people like Augustine and Aquinas, who, when they wrote about just and unjust law, Aquinas is writing very much from a natural law perspective, and Augustine really thought that God could tell you which ones were just and unjust, and that's actually it's quite important, because what Augustine and Aquinas have in common is that the source of understanding what makes law just or unjust isn't from the self. It's not, if I don't like it, if my opinion is that it's a bad law, that's why I ought to violate it, that it has to come from some external source. Now, you may say, well, what if you're not a Christian? What if you're not religious? Nevertheless, if you look at King's letter, one of the things he's very careful to do is to cite the work of secular philosophers as well on precisely this problem. What makes a law unjust is, at minimum, that it's inconsistent with a powerful and consistent moral theory. If it's just inconsistent with an instinct, if it's just a feeling, those feelings matter. I don't mean to trivialize them, but I'm skeptical that it would be appropriate or even possible to build a movement around them. And to go back to the example you mentioned before, so in his conversation with the white moderates, what's striking is that while some of the conversation, as we've all said, addressed the question of time and patience, I think a lot of us addressed the question of complacency. And what he seems to be saying in the letter and what he said elsewhere is he's trying to engage people when he says raise the tension, not just raise the tension so people will say, okay, you win, we'll stop, but to get people to get people to think seriously, to challenge whatever their own particular instincts may be. That process is crucial. Now, it's a difficulty today because when you look around, you can look at people of any political persuasion and they can tell you a long list of laws they think are terribly, terribly unjust. And by and large, they're decent people who happen to have very different ideas. One of the powers, I mentioned it before, while not everyone, I think, always has to be willing to suffer the consequences, one of the powerful aspects of suffering the consequences for disobedience is it tests the depth of our commitment to the cause. It's easy for any of us to say, well, that law shouldn't be enforced, and I don't like that one, and I'm on the left, and I don't like this one, I'm on the right, and I don't like that one. We can all say that in conversation, but to risk for it, to go out and take a chance, I think, is where the commitment is really tested. King was willing to test his own commitment, but he was also, in a sense, by raising the tension level, willing to test the commitments of others to complacency, to try to drag them into the dialogue, where instead of just saying, let's wait, let's slow down, they had to take a position. They had to say either we're with you or we're against you. They had to have a reason. They had to engage in the conversation. That's crucial to that kind of disobedience.
But when you say depth of commitment being tested, why does a depth of commitment make you more correct or about whether it's an unjust law?
You can have a very shallow commitment. You can have a guess, and you can throw a dart, and you can be right.
And you can be deeply committed to something and be wacky.
You can be deeply committed to something, be wacky, or be wicked. That's absolutely correct. But it is the willingness to suffer that draws our attention, if you will, that forces us into the conversation. When you see someone dragged off to prison or to jail or to be fined, whatever it may be, there is a response. It evokes something. It was powerful in the civil rights movement, in part because the King was right about the moral law. That is, when it engaged people, ultimately people were dragged out of complacency. And I think that part of what King understood correctly is that when the people who made up that group of moderates are dragged out of complacency, the bad guys lose. There just aren't enough bad guys to sustain the good guys who were there at the beginning, plus the people who can't be complacent anymore. If you can't drag people out of their complacency, I think it's appropriate to wonder if you may be mistaken in your position, but it's not proof that you're mistaken in your position. It may just be that the struggle is going to be a little longer. And along that line, when the first anti-slavery societies were formed in the United States in the 18th century, largely by Quakers, one thing that's really striking about the societies is that a lot of their critics, including critics who were against slavery, said this is really silly because you know this is not going to be accomplished in your lifetime. And a lot of the Quakers in particular who joined the societies and formed the societies said, but that's not the measure of whether we're right, you see. The reason to do it is to start the battle. Some battles can be won quickly, some won't be won quickly, and it's important to remember the civil rights movement was not won quickly. We think of the bus boycott, but you really have to go back to 1619 in thinking of the length of time when we think about waiting that we're talking about with this enormous structure that had to be torn down bit by bit. And even today, tragic though it is well, it's very, very different. It's a very different country. There are pieces of the structure there that aren't torn down yet.
Mm-hmm. Like what? What is the thing that bothers you the most?
Well, I'll give you two examples. One is the enormous resegregation in schools in America, especially, dare I say it, in the North. The most segregated area of schools in the country is the northeastern United States. The least segregated is the South. Why is the South least segregated? Because the civil rights movement concentrated resources there quite appropriately, because that's where it was worst. It made sense to concentrate the resources there. But now when you look at the shape of schools across the country, the most segregated are in the Northeast and in California. That's where you find the most segregated schools in America. There's a lot of data on this, and I think it's a terrible, terrible thing. A lot of the resegregation is due to housing patterns. A lot of it is due to white parents choosing private schools. There's a lot of reasons for it. Whatever the reasons, I think it's a real tragedy. That's one of the things, for example, where the structure that we thought that so much work had been done that seemed to be undone has, in a sense, reinvented itself. The other thing is, which is linked to that if you just look at any leading indicator, you look at the differences between the black community and the white community in America, and now the Latino community as well, and you can see that while on almost every measure the gap has closed significantly, the gaps are still awfully big, especially in income and education, and particularly for black men. Mm-hmm. Even as black women have accelerated considerably in both of those areas, black men have actually fallen in the last couple of decades further behind, especially over the last 10 years.
This is a great work of writing and literature, and that's what you do that's the trade that you ply. Are you worried that the literary instinct and its connection to history may be getting lost these days when we're not as literary, we're not writing as much?
Well, I'm a poet who writes about history. I also write about social justice. And so I don't think that those things are getting lost in the literary sense. But I just have to say, in listening to this conversation, I was disappointed that you didn't ask me about unjust laws, because my parents broke a couple of them back in Mississippi in the mid-60s.
Well, let me ask you about unjust laws.
And they relate also, as you were saying, to the current language that we hear about same-sex marriage. But my parents broke laws of anti-miscegenation laws. They broke the law by the two laws that they broke. Not only was it illegal to have an interracial, to get married in Mississippi, but it was also illegal to leave the state to go to one that you could get married and then return to the state. And this is what they did.
Do you see the analogy with same-sex marriage, or do you find that a spurious analogy?
Oh, I do see it as the same, because it is infringing on not gay rights,
but
who
rights. You are. Yeah.
But rights. I also wanted to say something about that indictment, or conversation that Dr. King was having with the white moderates in terms of the form. The epistolary form is a brilliant choice in my mind, because not only is he responding to those clergymen, those named people who wrote the statement that he found in the paper and began to write his marginalia to. But the form, the epistolary form, allows us to overhear, in some ways, what is a private conversation. And he is directing it toward them, but it's meant for all of us to overhear. And so when we overhear it, what we see is this perfect intersection between the private and the public sphere. I mean, I learned a lot about that as a poet who needs to say something about history. To find a direct address to this person so that all these other people can overhear it is really addressing it to those people as well. But the technique is what allows us to feel a kind of intimacy in the language. There's even a moment that he says to them, I confess.
Yeah.
He has to confess something. So we feel as if we're overhearing something that was meant for these people, but obviously, rhetorically, was meant for everyone.
When I hear that epistolatory form in the letter in a chatty way, I think of Benjamin Franklin, whose autobiography begins, Dear Son. But in this setting, I probably should think of the New Testament, in which the epistolary form is the letters from the apostles are so important. Do you think that was informing him?
Well, it sounds like almost everything that one could know informed him.
Right. But very much when you read the New Testament, it is done as letters for this reason, letters to make a public statement, but also do it with an intimate conversation. Is that?
Well, and he makes an explicit reference to Paul about the appeal to Macedonian aid, which is the appeal. I'm in Birmingham because I need to, as Paul did, answer the appeal for Macedonian aid.
And that was the epistle from St. Paul to the Macedonians?
Well, where he was asked by the Macedonian churches actually to help raise money for them and resources for them, and to help adjudicate.
You were turning this into a fundraising document?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing this forever in this business. But also just the fact that he's writing from jail. I mean, so many of Paul's letters were written from jail. So there is an implicit, he's obviously comparing himself to Paul, even without saying so. And he also quotes him at one point. He has 2 or 3 resonances from 1 Corinthians 13 that run through the letter. But I think just the basic thing of, as you say, writing a letter to the faith community from jail is like, he's like channeling Paul. The situation is just Paul all over again. And I think that has a certain rhetorical power for those people.
Have you ever thought of using the letter form then as a poem, or to do the intimacy as well as the public?
You've obviously not read any of my books.
No, I'm offering up your chance to read one, and so I was teeing you up because I think you have one, right?
Yes, it's not a letter, though.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
But it is still something that, of course, is meant to be overheard by all of us. I decided the poem that I would read, because Dr. King mentions as one of his examples of the unjust laws, the attempts to keep black citizens from voting, and because we face again today significant challenges to voting rights, I decided to read this poem called Incident. Now, as I mentioned, my parents had an illegal marriage, breaking the law to do so. And in the mid-'60s, we were living for a short amount of time at my grandmother's house on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. My grandmother lived right across the street from the Mount Olive Baptist Church, and the church didn't have its own driveway, so she used to let the church park its bus there. And at that point, they were doing voter registration drives to get some of these people who had been disenfranchised registered to vote. And so we never knew if the incident that occurred happened because of this interracial family living in the house or because it was meant to terrorize the people of the church for holding this voting rights drive, this voting registration drive. It also relates a little bit to what I see and what I've learned from reading Dr. King's work, the use of repetition, those phrases that we might hear again and again, and the refrains that we hear, because it seems necessary if you must utter something, if you must say it, and to make people really hear it, it's important not just to say it, but to say it again. Incident. We tell the story every year, how we peered from the windows, shades drawn, though nothing really happened, the charred grass now green again. We peered from the windows, shades drawn, at the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, the charred grass still green. Then we darkened our rooms, lit the hurricane lamps. At the cross trussed like a Christmas tree, a few men gathered, white as angels in their gowns. We darkened our rooms and lit hurricane lamps, the wicks trembling in their fonts of oil. It seemed the angels had gathered, white men in their gowns. When they were done, they left quietly. No one came. The wicks trembled all night in their fonts of oil. By morning, the flames had all dimmed. When they were done, the men left quietly. No one came. Nothing really happened. By morning, all the flames had dimmed. We tell the story every year.
And the repetition is on flames had dimmed, they left, nothing happened, nobody came. Tell us about your own memory from back then and why those were the things that you felt bore repetition.
Well, actually, the entire poem is a pantoum, and so every line that I say is repeated once with subtle variations. So not just the images that you're talking about in the end, but the poem began with "We tell the story every year" and ends with "We tell the story every year." In a pantoum, you have a four-line stanza that sort of sets up the narrative of the poem, and then lines 2 and 4 come down and take positions 1 and 3 in the next stanza, and then you write a new 2 and 4, which then come down and become 1 and 3, and so on until you use the original 1 and 3 in reverse order from the first stanza. What that does for me, certainly the incident itself is about the cross burning, but if you think about it, is that what's most important about the moment of the poem? The poem is more interested in historical memory. The poem helps to enact the kind of memory necessary to prevent forgetting of things that we must not forget. Mm-hmm. It also relies, of course, on a little bit of understatement. The lines, "Nothing really happened," something definitely happened.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, let me go back to you on a question from the letter, which is injustice anywhere, the concept that we have to fight injustice anywhere. I look at things happening, say, overseas, in Uganda, the past couple of days, as we're talking about gay rights. Is it our moral duty to get involved in things like that? You write about just and unjust wars and foreign policy based on morality. Or is that something that we should have some more humility on?
Well, that's a great question. There are different sides to the problem. To try to take what King says literally is impossible. No one can get involved everywhere, and there's certainly injustice everywhere, but the fact that one can't get involved everywhere doesn't mean one shouldn't get involved anywhere. And that's a crucial point, whether one is thinking about one's personal decisions about what to get involved in, what causes to fight for, or whether one is thinking about a nation's decisions about what causes to fight for. King was an apostle of nonviolence, but as he made clear in his writing elsewhere, he was not saying there are no causes worth going to war for. He was not saying you could never have a just war. He was a devotee of Christian just war theory. As a follower of Niebuhr, he'd have to be. So King certainly was of the view there are times when it is appropriate to take up arms for states, not for individuals. I'm not sure he ever, anywhere that I know at least, suggested individuals were right in taking up arms. I never saw him write, for example, about the they used to call them the colored mutual protection societies that arose after the Civil War, where the black farmers would band together to guard each other's houses at night against the night riders. I assume he would have been in favor of that. But that was an emergency sort of situation.
But is there a clear...
But in the heart of the question, I think we have taken King's letter, and from the other people who've written about this over the years, there's two things. One can't get involved everywhere, but one ought to be involved, which is to say, again, when you think of the problem with the white moderates is the complacency. It would be different if what they were saying was, we can't do this cause because we're busy with this cause. It may seem like a thin excuse, but it's plausible. That can happen. We all know people have a single issue, and that's what they do. The terrible thing about injustice is because there's so much of it, and because every injustice seems to crowd, especially when filtered through the media, it becomes easy to be complacent. I was on a panel in England a few years ago with a reporter from the BBC who'd just gotten back from a couple of years in Africa. And he was talking about how frustrating it was to try to bring home some of the real disasters, especially in those days, what is being called by some historians the African Civil War in and around Central Africa. And he said that the problem was, he thought, that when you tell these terrible stories of things happening in Africa, that what people do is they look at the report on television or they look at it in the paper and they say, that's really terrible. How can they live that way? And then they go on to something else, some domestic issue that they really are heavily involved in, that the problem seems so enormous that the view is somebody ought to do something about that. And part of what I think King was getting at is that when you think of injustice in the world, the someone is actually just people. It's just people deciding to get involved or not involved. It's a bit of a trope when King says he has to be in Birmingham because there is injustice. There are just a lot of places he could have gone to. I think it would have been enough for him, it wouldn't have been as poetic, it would have been enough for him to say that of all the injustices, this is the one that I choose to get involved in. The terrible thing is when people choose to be involved in nothing, in that nothing touches us enough to move us from our complacency. One of the virtues of church, this is going back to the point that Dean was making a moment ago, is at its best the encounter in the Christian church with Christ, but in other religious traditions, the encounter with God in whatever form ought to move us out of our complacency, not just in the sense that we suddenly discover that these great issues, but it ought to challenge us. We sit here tonight, we sit here, all of us, with a variety of well-formed views on a number of issues, and we tend to think we're right and other people are, I don't know why they hold those crazy views, but sometimes we're wrong. And one of the things that an encounter with God ought to do is sometimes shock us out of our complacency by saying, you know, there's a point here that I missed. If we remain, the bishop and I were just talking about this before we came down, if I remain unchanged in my views from the encounter with God, then the encounter somehow hasn't gone right. There's that wonderful line in the middle of the play, Mass Appeal, if you've never seen it, the play about the older Catholic priest who's supposed to be tutoring the younger Catholic priest, and the younger Catholic priest is given this very fiery sermon. I can't remember what the subject of it is. And one of the parishioners is on the front step of the church, and he's very upset. And he says to the older priest, you know, I don't come to church to be preached to. He says, there's that kind of flavor one faces sometimes, but I think that church can shock us. Direct action can shock us. A lot of things can shock us out of our complacency, and that is supposed to help teach us that an injustice that doesn't affect us directly may nevertheless be one in which we ought to be involved. Again, not everybody can get involved in everything. Then we fritter away our efforts. The efficiency of the division of labor even works among activists, but it's important to be involved in something in a very serious way.
I'm going to make that the final point to ask the other people up here with me, which is Stephen's point about what we need to be shocked out of our complacency about, and maybe something that the letter from the Birmingham jail can help us think about in that regard. I think one of the examples you gave was the fact that we have resegregated our urban school systems, which is something
yes, Washington, D.C. actually is one of the worst cities in the nation in terms of racial segregation in public schools. So that's something to be shocked about.
Right, and so that's yours. And so maybe I can start with you, Dean, and I'll end with Natasha, but let you use this to say whatever you might want to say, but also address some of what Stephen just said.
A quick addendum to what I said earlier. One of the things I do want to say is even though King did inform my decision about same-sex marriages here, that is really not an act of civil disobedience in the sense that that decision came at the end of same-sex marriage is legal in D.C. It became legal in Maryland, which is our entire diocese. And then it was also a long process in the Episcopal Church for a liturgy for same-sex blessings. I was very much involved in kind of civil disobedience stuff 20 years ago about this, but our decision to do this now was really the culmination of a kind of legal process. For me, I think one of the moments that really touches me in this letter is where he says to the ministers, you know, you commended the police for keeping the peace. I can't really join you in that. And I'm disappointed that you didn't turn around and commend the black community for its perseverance and peacefulness. And I think the thing I feel the most danger about being complacent in is I tend to empathize with the people I know, and I tend not to have enough engagement with the people I don't know. And so the issue of who are we in this culture, and how do we embrace and celebrate our differences, and how do we come to know each other in a way where we can really empathize with each other? I think we become very complacent in our divisions. And I think King is calling us to a really much more comprehensive vision of not only Christianity, but what it means to be an American. And this letter spurs me to move out of my complacent comfort zone.
Julian Bond.
I don't know how to follow this. It's too well said and too important. I was thinking about my own situation. Last year, I got arrested at the White House protesting the pipeline. And it was something I've always thought. I was a good environmentalist. I believed in clean water, fresh air, all those things. And had never done anything about it, never given any money to anybody about it, never done a thing about it, never raised my voice about it. And was approached by people to do this, and I did it. And it was awfully uncomfortable to get arrested and to have your hands locked behind your back, painful. But I felt so great having done it. It's just a wonderful thing that I did. And I was so happy about myself. I want to get that feeling over and over again and do it some more.
And we should be shocked out of our complacency about the way we're stewards of this planet.
Absolutely.
Final words, if you would, please.
Well, there's the place in the letter that Dr. King is talking about how one of the sins of segregation is that it breeds a sense of superiority in one group and inferiority in the other. And one of the things that I think is still a troubling thing that we live with, even so many years later and after desegregation, are the deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of racial difference that manifest themselves in ongoing ideas of white supremacy or black inferiority. And what is saddest to me about it is that it is probably the good people, just as it was the good people that he had to address in that letter, who haven't examined those deeply ingrained notions.
Did you want to say one final word?
Well, one final word, actually, just on this very last point, that the deeply ingrained notions about superiority and inferiority aren't just deeply ingrained in white people. That is, you have lots and lots of people of color who've, over the decades and the centuries, have internalized those norms as well. And it has a terribly powerful, depressing effect on the community. That one thing that makes activism hard, one thing that creates a lot of the issues that we see, is this deeply ingrained notion that's going to take a lot of work to shatter. The one last tiny point I want to make about the letter, one of the best things about the letter is the very end. the very last paragraph, that after all of this, the really remarkable charity, I think it's sincere, that he shows at the end toward those he's criticized, and asking them to forgive him if anything he says has been false and unjust. And that also, I think, is a part of the power of the letter, that as sharp as its criticism is, there's not a point you can find where it is mean-spirited, where it is rude, or where it is condemnatory about the very people he's criticizing harshly. That's a rhetorical skill that is all but lost in the world today, and that we could, I think, gain a lot by studying it again.
Thank you all very much. And I think the best way to do that, the best way to overcome any of these complacencies or inferiorities, is simply by reading every year the letter from the Birmingham jail. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Professor. Good to see you. Thank you so very much. Wonderful poem. Thank you. Good. Great to see you, Al.